programming is where you're describing to the machine how to do something. And so telling it how to play tic-tac-toe, telling it how to play the board game Monopoly, telling it how to convert numbers from one base to another. And the idea of, okay, there's these simple instructions, but if you put them together, then you can synthesize something quite complex. It's a fascinating kind of mathematical thing. How can you make it fast? How can you make it small? And I went through several phases of doing more complex programs where people who were great programmers would look at my work, give me feedback on it, and you get so you can be quite a good programmer. And it was kind of such an intense activity between the age of 13 and 17 that we learned a lot. Eventually, one of the programs we took on was the idea of the scheduling of our school. When should the classes meet? Who should be in which section? So you have all these requests for people who want different classes and keeping them small and not having the teachers teach too many classes in a row. Very complex kind of software problem. And actually, when the school first asked me to do it, when I was 15, I said that I didn't know how. And they asked some adults to do it, and that didn't work. And then about a year later, I'd figured out how to do it. And so my friends and I actually did the software that did all this high school scheduling. It had some fantastic benefits to us. We got paid for doing it. It was exactly the kind of complex problem that developed my skills very well. And we got some degree of control over who was in our classes, and so it combined the best of everything. Initially, when that teletype showed up, there were probably 20 kids who sort of showed an interest, and it was confusing enough that it got winnowed down to about 8 or 9 fairly quickly who were quite serious about it. And then there were about 4 of us who were hyper serious, kind of doing it day and night. And 2 of them were 2 years older than I was, and 1 was my same age. Now, in a high school, people are 2 years ahead of you. They don't socialize with the young kids all that much. So the idea that we had this group of 4 of us, was kind of unusual. We called it the Lakeside Programming Group. And one of the companies we'd been doing work for went bankrupt, the one in Seattle. And so we went to one in Portland, Oregon, Computer Center Corporation, C-Cubed, which had been in the University District in Seattle. And we'd spent a lot of time there. And they were wonderful to us. They weren't a well-run business, so they went bankrupt. So this company down in Portland, Oregon, said, hey, we're not just going to give you computer time. You have to do something. So we agreed to write this payroll program. And a payroll program is surprisingly complicated. There's all these taxes and reports and things at the state level and federal level. Anyway, they said, well, if you could write one of those, we'd at least give you free computer time. And so I negotiated that deal. And the 2 older members, Paul Allen and Rick, said, well, there's not enough work to go around, so we're going to take charge of this. And I said, okay, I'm not that interested, because I had in mind how I wanted to do the payroll program. And so they messed around for about 3 months, didn't get much done, and then said, well, you join back up. And I said, okay, but so I'm in charge of this, and it's going to kind of set a precedent for future activities. But they said, no, that's fine. And so we actually finished this payroll program. It was a lot of work. The friend who was my age, Kent Evans, and I ended up doing the lion's share of the work. Now, tragically, right as he and I finished that, he was killed in a mountain climbing accident. And So then there were just three of us left who'd been extremely involved, including Paul Allen, who was the one who was reading the magazines even more than I was. And he was the one who actually saw this computer on a chip, so-called microprocessor, in a very small, obscure article. But he saw that it would be deeply important and brought that to me in 1971. So we were still 15. I was 15, and he was 17 at the time. So these CQ people have this computer, which is a time-sharing computer, and they're letting us come in at night. And they had this deal with the company who made the computer, Digital Equipment Corporation, that they had this acceptance period. If they could find problems with it, they could delay their rental payments. And so they thought of us as kind of monkeys that might find some problems and help them delay their rental payments. Well, that was a fair analysis, because at first we were just completely goofing around. Like we'd try to run hundreds of jobs at the same time, or have all the jobs try and grab the same resources to see if we could get the system to fail. And we did, in kind of this brute force approach. And so they would report that as a problem and delay their rental payment. Well, as a few months went by, actually about 4 months by the end of it, we had gotten very sophisticated. In fact, we'd gotten the source code of the operating system out of the garbage can, and we're reading it. And the kind of problems we were finding were far more subtle. In fact, we'd not only find the problem, we'd look and we'd suggest how they might fix it. Well, anyway, Digital Equipment got so tired of this, they said, look, you got to pay. You're going to be able to find problems, these kinds of problems forever, but we need to get paid. And so then there was a question whether they would let us stay there or not. And it was pretty tenuous. And so Paul and I, we understood the system well enough that we could look at all the passwords of the various accounts. And so, we could use literally any account. And then people, when they found out we'd done that, they got kind of mad about that. They weren't sure how mad they should be about it because we hadn't really caused any damage, but, it wasn't a good thing. Computer hacking was literally just being invented at the time. And so fortunately, we got off with a bit of a warning. But there actually was a period that because of that, they said we weren't supposed to use the computer. And it was over a summer. And Paul actually went up to the University of Washington and found ways to use the computer and get connected up. And he took a while before he told me, and then eventually he told me about that, and we got back on. I was really quite serious about math at the time and various science things. Paul had actually read more science fiction than I had by a lot. And so he and I would talk about that. But I had plenty of things. It wasn't some great tragedy. But then we got, pulled back in. And then that company went bankrupt. And then we had the work for this Portland company on the payroll program. And then we had the scheduling program. And so, we were lucky. There were always kind of things that not only gave us an opportunity, but exposed us to that next level. After the payroll program, then there was a computer project to use computers to control all the electricity grid in the dams of the Pacific Northwest. It's a government agency called Bonneville Power had done a contract with a company called TRW to use computers to do all this control. And TRW had committed to do all this really high reliability, great software work. Well, they found it more difficult than they expected. And so they were looking for people who understood these kinds of computers, which Paul Allen and I had done a lot of work on. This was the same computer that was at Computer Center Corporation and at this Portland company, Information Sciences. Anyway, so we were kind of famous, but nobody had met us because we'd filed these problem reports. And by the end of these problem reports, they were so sophisticated, it was like, who are these guys, out in Seattle telling us how to fix all this stuff? And so when TRW is saying, hey, we're desperate, find us, they're telling Digital Equipment, who makes these things, find us the best programmers. And somebody says, well, there's Gates and Allen. And somebody says, well, nobody's really met them. But yeah, but they're really good. We ought to be able to track them down. So they find us, this one guy, and we go for an interview, and these two kids show up, and when I was interviewed, I was 16 when they interviewed me. So they're like, well, we can't hire you. But, then they talked to us about software, and we clearly know a lot. And when you're young and you know a lot, people don't have any kind of intermediate thing. You're either, what you're supposed to be, which is a kid who doesn't know that much, or they think, whoa, what, this guy's the limit. Well, we were pretty good programmers. But anyway, so we got jobs at this TRW, and that exposed me to some programmers who were way better than I was, who critiqued my work. I could look at their work. This one guy was really a phenomenal programmer, and he would just take my stuff and rip it apart, in this super constructive way. Anyway, it was a brilliant thing, and so part of my senior year and the summer before and after the senior year, Paul and I were down in Vancouver, Washington, working on this project. So it kind of took our understanding to a whole new level, and it exposed us to a bunch of people there. And Paul, the whole time, ever since he'd seen that microprocessor article, was saying, there's an opportunity here. This is going to be big. We ought to think what we're going to do about this. So we kept talking about that.